education and some ideas for going forward. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, their name, their pronouns if they choose to provide them, and whether or not they're a Tillman scholar, and what they do in education. So I'll go ahead and go first. I am Garris. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a 2020 Tillman scholar. I'm currently a fifth-year doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania. Almost done my dissertation. And I also teach classes in education at Penn and also Westchester. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first panelist, Savia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Savia Hayo, she, her. I am a 2020 Tillman scholar. In the Air Force, I was an instructor and an evaluator, and I just completed my master's in special education with a focus on autism spectrum disorder. In addition to that, I have 2 children, and one of my children has disabilities. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Harris. I am a leadership coach for principals and assistant principals in the School District of Philadelphia. It's an honor to be here today.
Good morning, my name is Erica Newman. I go by she, her. I am a 2021 Tillman Scholar. This is my first in-person event, so I'm super excited to be here. I am an elementary school teacher. I am currently working on a doctorate in learning and organizational change, specializing in STEM education in elementary school. And I also have 3 boys at home that are 12, 10, and 6.
My name is Erin Bailey. I am not a Tillman scholar, but I'd like to represent my brother Blake Gaughan, Captain Blake Gaughan, who's currently serving as a Special Forces Infantry Officer. I was an educator during the pandemic, during virtual learning. I was a reading specialist and English second language specialist. I also became a mother during the pandemic to my daughter Ruth. And I'm currently the Director of Content and Programs at Reading is Fundamental, which is a national nonprofit for children's literacy. And I'm also working on my dissertation, and it's about outdoor learning during COVID-19.
Howdy everyone, my name is Amber Rios. I'm a 2018 Tillman Scholar. My husband was a Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy. And I have worked as the Director of Online Education at Texas A&M University since 2017, so during the pandemic. Previously, I was a 6th through 12th grade English language arts teacher in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and assistant principal. And I just defended, so it's on the horizon now. And so I will be taking an assistant professor position at Kansas State University this fall.
Hi everybody, I'm Emily Baylock. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a 2018 Tillman Scholar, an Air Force veteran. I completed my PhD at George Washington University in translational health science. And prior to that, I have been an occupational therapist for the last 15 years, primarily working in older adult care and something called aging in place. And so I'm also a professor at Rutgers University, where I have spent a lot of time doing some innovation related to the pandemic. Prior to that, I was at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and so I'll tell you a little bit about the kinds of things I did while I was there. Oh, and I have 2 kids. I'm also a parent, and I homeschooled them. My kids, one of my children special needs as well.
We won't tell them you forgot about them.
Good, thank you to all the panelists. So just to orient you all to this discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about the agenda for the discussion for today, why we're all here, and then we'll also have some time at the end for some questions. So throughout the discussion, if you do have any questions or anything that you're wondering about or anything to add to what we will be discussing today, please write it down. We will have the Q&A mic that's set up for you all to go to ask your questions, and we'll answer them to the best of our abilities. For the agenda, we're going to start out with just doing a little bit of contextualizing around COVID in education. Since all of us here are either students and or parents and or educators, we all have experiences with learning in COVID, and we're continuing to navigate this. And so the purpose of this panel is for us to glean what the knowledge and the experiences from the panelists here, the ways in which they have navigated this pandemic, and some ideas to future-proof what we can do for children, for college students, and for ourselves going forward. I'm going to go ahead and start out with thinking about taking a journey. And we're all going to, I'm an early childhood person, and I didn't know how like the structure of this room was going to be, because we were all going to be in a circle. I would have had us play a game, but since you all are in seats, I want you all to just imagine with me, okay? So we're going to pretend that this room that we're in here is a time machine, okay? And so in this time machine, I want you to think back, okay? March 13th, 2020. And on this day, there was a national state of emergency declared as the novel coronavirus began to spread throughout the United States. And with that, policies, decisions, leadership actions, pivots, accommodations, differentiation, so many things happened at one time. And particularly for education, for children. Many issues of equity came up. Many issues of ableism came up. Many issues of uncertainty came up. And I want you to think about where you were, how you responded, how your kids, how you transitioned. And as we're in this time machine, I'm going to turn to the panel here. This is in no order. I have some general questions for the panel, some targeted ones as we go along in the discussion, and then we're going to see what we glean from this dialogue here. So for the panel, to get us started, I want you all to think about education as we knew for all of us, how it would change, disrupt our lives, disrupt our kids' lives, their learning. What do you remember about this time? How did you and your family adjust during this time? How did COVID impact education for you and or your family?
Well, I'll start, because I'm shy or ever have a lack of words. So during the pandemic, I was a PhD student, getting ready to take my comprehensive examinations. I was also working as a researcher and kind of fading out of the clinical world. And my husband is a registered nurse, and he was a frontline COVID nurse as well. So and then of course my two children at the time were in kindergarten and second grade. And so we needed to shift to doing their homeschooling, which was incredibly challenging for me. I had to shift. I was also teaching at Thomas Jefferson University in a course called Professional Issues and Trends. And so I needed to shift my students to an online platform. And I really wanted to help them to understand the implications of what was happening nationally and all over the world. Words like pandemic, the students didn't know what that meant. Words like flatten the curve, understanding what we needed to do to, minimize how many people were in hospitals. And, so I really tried to use it as an opportunity for the students to learn about that. I isolated, much like the rest of us, and I was particularly concerned that we would be the ones to get and spread COVID because of the position that my husband is in. My mental health significantly suffered during this time. I think all PhDs have some significant suffering that occurs. So it was really a challenge to put on all of those different hats to try to have my kids have the best possible education that they could, to entertain them, to ensure that my students were getting the benefits of their learning, to try to support clinicians out in the field. So it was quite a challenge and a really emotional and difficult time. We also lost somebody very close to us within the first couple of weeks of the pandemic. So there was a lot of devastation that occurred in our household.
Thank you.
So for me, we were actually, I'm from San Antonio, Texas. We were on spring break when the pandemic hit. It was like a wave coming across the United States. We were in New Orleans, we were visiting New Orleans, and the day we were leaving is when the disaster, national disaster was called. So my kids were panicked. We got home, everybody felt good, and then as soon as we got home, our district said that they were extending spring break for a week, and so it was like party central in my house. I have 3 boys, like I said, I have 3 boys, so they were on cloud 9 thinking like we have an extra week for spring break. And I kind of started to go into panic mode as far as my own classroom, my own students. I was teaching 5th grade at the time, and so I immediately got into kind of online teaching mode, what I needed to do to make sure that my students were getting what they needed. I knew because of our family circumstances, my boys were good. They had everything that they needed. But I was really worried about the mental health of my students, not being able to get to school, not being able to have the consistency. So that kind of became what occupied most of my thoughts and energy. And then shortly after that, I started my doctoral program. And so in that respect, it was kind of a blessing in disguise for me because I was getting the ball rolling with this program, not having to spend 50 to 60 hours a week in my 5th grade classroom and with my boys doing all of their events, their soccer and drum lessons and baseball. And so it was kind of a blessing in disguise in that respect, but like Emily, it definitely took a mental health toll on me trying to manage everything and keep everything in check.
I would add, I remember sitting in a coaching conversation with one of my first year principals that I was supporting. And, you know, just the anxiety around who do we take leadership from? Because there was no one ready to really commit to a decision about what was going to happen with the schools. And in a district that is already under-resourced, understaffed, under everything, it was really about thinking about how do we navigate this? How do we navigate this unknown? And how does the principal make the decision without really having all of the information, knowing that he or she is going to be the person who's going to have to respond to all of the questions that come from parents. And so I remember having this conversation with one principal in particular, just really seeing her anxiety around what do I do? And this is my first year leading the school. And you know, and really kind of taking that, and multiplying that by 15 school leaders who I supported, it was a very, very stressful time, and the only advice that I could provide at that very moment is really to tell that school leader that it's okay to not know, right? And to really, really think about just being a human in this moment and not just a school leader, being a human in this moment so that you can understand the fears and anxiety of people that you're about to lead, you know, through this pandemic.
Thank you all. I want to touch on, so in and Erica's responses, we heard a theme about, with your role as parents, the uncertainty, the ambiguity there. Jason, things that, the question that you posed, right, about who do we turn to for leadership and how do we navigate this? This is so novel, so new. I want to pose a question to the panel. As we progress throughout the discussion, we're going to begin with talking about learning for our listeners, for our early learners in K-12, going all the way up the continuum to speaking about how this has impacted college students. And so with beginning for the folks on this panel who are either parents or worked with kids, as we begin to transition to Zoom, to having to get hotspots at home, what did that look like for you? How did you support your kids? How did you make, or how did you cultivate learning in a space that was so different than what we have been doing before?
So my house was a circus. My husband was trying to do work. We had one of our kids, once we had Zoom set up. Fortunately, we had Wi-Fi. We did not have a device for everybody, but we shared between the 5 of us. My husband was trying to get his work done. He had our, at the time, second grader that he kind of managed and kept on task as best as possible. And I was in a different part of the house with my pre-K student and my 4th grader at the time. My 4th grader thankfully was fine. Like, he's very self-motivated and he would be done with everything he needed to do for the day by 9:30, and he was keeping himself occupied, so he was fine. The pre-Ker, it was so fun watching them try to Zoom with 12 pre-Kers. There was like 15 different conversations going on with the 12 kids, and then like the 3 teachers. People are going and getting like their stuffed animals and showing it to the screen while the teachers are talking about, grouping numbers. It was really comical and entertaining to watch. But I also developed a better appreciation for my middle son. Is not as academically motivated. He's much more social, and he had out of the 3, he definitely had the hardest time with the online learning. He really thrives in a social setting, and so he was having a really hard time. They were doing dual language, so most of the instruction was in Spanish, and my husband and I don't speak fluent Spanish. My husband doesn't speak any Spanish, and so that was frustrating for him. And my second grader was doing everything he could to not have to do work, and I was entertained because I was in the other room just listening to them, but my husband more than once just yelled, it's bad enough that it's in Spanish, but they changed math. How did they change math? And so it was, I think that was the point where I realized that there was no way that we could hold all of these kids accountable, not even in my house, much less across our campus or across the district, for learning the things that they needed to learn. So my husband and I just decided we were going to make the most of it, do as much as they can, do what we needed to do as best as possible, but we looked for other opportunities for them to learn and things that they wouldn't have been necessarily able to do in a traditional school year had it not been for COVID.
I agree with that. When it began, I had a 3-year-old and an almost 5-year-old, and so preschool was finished. I was in the middle of writing a thesis for my Air Force master's degree, and my husband was wrapping up grad school at GW, and so all of a sudden we've got 2 little ones, and we're trying to finish school and all the other things, and so we just thought outside of the box as much as we could. I mean, there were so many uncertainties at that time and unknowns, so we really isolated. But all of a sudden, we became super hippie-ish. I mean, like, we're going outside, we're going on hikes, we're like going on, like, the kids loved it. Like, we would find, we live in Northern Virginia in the DC area, and so we found all these places that we had never even attempted to go before because life was so busy. And so we're taking our kids, and they're putting on their rain boots, and we're going into the creeks, and we're going hiking and climbing. So it was really challenging, and there were a lot of really early mornings where I'm like, I'm doing homework today, like you watch them, and just a lot of that just kind of balanced everything out. But we did try to find some of the silver lining, and that was in doing, that outdoor learning that, you're going to talk about later.
Yeah, so I think to pick up on that a little bit, with the outdoor learning spaces, the school that I was at was intentional about screen time. We were fully virtual for 2020, 2021. And so the school actually ended the virtual learning day at 1 o'clock to limit the screen time, and then opened the opportunity to, after 1 o'clock, for students to meet with their teachers in outdoor learning settings all around DC. And that's where I collected data for my dissertation research. And when I met with the principal to design my study, he told me to be prepared for anything in terms of families. Although there were going to be students who intentionally signed up for these outdoor learning opportunities, it was very likely that families would bring all of their children. So we had multi-age groups of kids. The ability for kids to learn in multi-age groups that they don't get when they're in a classroom assigned to just their age group. The other thing was families attending the events. A lot of times families wanted to engage with the event and come along with the students. Other times families just wanted to go into their car and use it as some respite time. And other times they took that opportunity to go run some errands. So we were there for childcare. So these kids were outboard with us for 1 to 2 hours at a time, giving the families the opportunity to either engage with their kids outdoors or that break that they needed that they weren't getting during the virtual learning.
As a mom and an occupational therapist, I felt like I have permission from my son to share a little bit about his story and his disabilities. And I felt like I had to be not only his mother and his teacher, but also his occupational therapist who's receiving both occupational therapy services as well as speech therapy services. And it was really challenging to try to incorporate all of those things that he needed. And then I felt like I was neglecting my daughter, who was a kindergartner. So I think trying to balance those roles was especially difficult. I also want to acknowledge my privilege. You know, I live in a school district that provided my children with laptops and provided them with internet service, like a booster in our home. And, you know, I couldn't help but reflect to be so thankful for that, but then also to become extremely concerned for families that, you know, weren't so fortunate. And if I was struggling with all of my knowledge and skills as an occupational therapist, what was happening in these households that didn't have the privileges that I had?
I want to thank you all for being so vulnerable and so forthcoming in your responses. And I want to build on this point that Emma is getting to, and I actually want to pose the first targeted question for Sadia with thinking about disability within this conversation. Given your experience and your background, coupled with your expertise in special education and the ways in which we support students on the autism spectrum, we're getting to think about the intersection of education and disability. And so as K-12 schools continue to adjust and reimagine what education would look like, the question that I have for you is, what do children with disabilities need from educators to be successful? And how do we do a better job of supporting their families and collaborating with parents, particularly with all the ambiguity with COVID?
Sure. So before I jump into the questions you asked, I really want to highlight something that you mentioned, and that's the intersection of education and disability. And for my family's experience, all of a sudden, and I think society as a whole, right? We saw so many the intersectionality between socioeconomic status, race, et cetera, during the pandemic. It was highlighted. For my family in particular, it was the intersection between education and disability. One of the first things I noticed, my passion is in early childhood special education, and my son went through their early intervention program. And at that point, during the pandemic, he wasn't in the program anymore, but I still keep in touch with a lot of his therapists. And when the pandemic began, my county was able to switch to virtual services for things like speech therapy and occupational therapy. However, some families didn't necessarily have access to the technology that was needed to do that. And so I recognize that I come from an area where my county was able to provide families that needed the devices. But at the same time, there were still some families that didn't have internet access. So that presents a huge question, like, okay, we're in a pandemic. What does accessibility really look like? Not just necessarily providing an iPad or a laptop, but how do we really ensure these families
have internet access, and it might not necessarily be through the public library because how do they get to the library? So that was the first big thing. And the second one that really hits home is what does inclusion really look like, right? So at this point in the pandemic, my son was in preschool and the county had switched to virtual preschool by the fall. So I've got my parenting hat on trying to navigate virtual preschool for a 3-year-old, which is just, crazy. But then I'm also, at the same time, I'm going through grad school for special education. So I'm like learning all these things and then I'm doing these things. And a lot of times I noticed that it just wasn't lining up. And so I think I hit my wall one morning. They had, for virtual preschool, they had like a morning meeting and it was like a song and they talk about the weather. And I look over at my son and the camera's on. We had to keep the cameras on. And he is just like playing with a puzzle and like running around, like dancing, jumping. And it's like his turn and the teacher calls on him. And I'm just like, hi, like, hey, everyone. And I started singing the morning meeting song. I'm like, good morning, good morning. My son's just like looking in the background. And then like I thought it was over and I thought I had turned the mic off and I didn't. And I said something that was not appropriate to say to a preschool classroom. And I still feel really bad about that. I asked the teacher about it later and nobody heard me, so I feel better. But that was my epiphany. It was like, all right, guys, like this is not working. And so at that point, I was like, something's got to give, and we've got to figure out a plan, right? And just some background for you guys. My husband's active duty Coast Guard, and so we had been living in the area for 2 years. So I had 2 years before the pandemic to line up the perfect team for my child, right? So I'm talking doctors, therapists. We had the best speech therapists. We had, such a great fit for OT. Educators. It was like you spend all this time and all these resources formulating this wonderful team that aligns with your family values, and really like it was a match for my son. And the pandemic hit, and then guess what? It all fell apart. And so at that point, something had to give, and we tried to find private services, which again, when we talk about access, I do recognize that we were in a position where we could access private services. During that time, I went and visited several different private preschools, and all of a sudden, I'm noticing the same pattern. Either they won't, and nobody says it openly, but my son he was a square peg in a round hole, and so okay, that wasn't a good fit. And then I found one, and it was like, we're inclusive, like we're all about it, and I'm like, yes. And we go visit and I'm like, so like how many teachers have, special education backgrounds or speech therapy or OT? And they're like, we're inclusive. And I'm like, okay. So for me, it really hit home the fact that, in school, I'm here learning about how inclusion means, it ensures like the best outcomes for all children, right? And like inclusion. And there's evidence-based intervention that shows the benefits of inclusion. But then in my real life, I'm like, okay, that's really great. Like, I really like you talking about that, but I don't see this in at least the preschool environment that I'm looking for my child. And so the pandemic for me was eye-opening, because I'm like, this is something that we need to fix. Like, there needs to be preschools available for all children, whether they're neurotypical or neurodivergent, and they have access to resources, to speech therapists, to OTs that really benefit all children. And so I hope that answered your question, but that was really that intersection between education and disability just hit home for me.
Thank you for saying that. And so we're hearing one, just considerations of access, considerations of who gets what, and then also considerations of hitting the mute button during Zoom meetings. Thank you, Sadia. I want to highlight one brilliant point that Sadia just brought up, right? Around begging the question of how, right? How do we do this? What leaders do we what do leaders need? What information can we give them? And how can they go about creating spaces where these issues of access and equity are mitigated as best we could? Jason, I want to turn to you. As the leader, you've been a principal, you've been a teacher, you coach principals in Philadelphia. And I know that we've heard some comments about some families who have had access, but I know that you've been in a space where you have supported families and students with very little access. And so with that being said, when the pandemic started, you were coaching school leaders and helping them to solve some problems even that we've just heard from the panel, and also some that you've seen on the ground. Jason, what are some ways that you supported school leaders, the principals, the families and parents in your school district to navigate the pandemic? And then a follow-up is, what are some issues that you faced and how did you mitigate them?
So, for, coaching work is really powerful work because we really think about how do we transform the leader in the moment, and really thinking about his or her leadership style. But I also had to acknowledge the fact that although I had been a principal for a number of years, for 14 years, I had never led a school during the pandemic. And so I really had to be humble first and recognize what other experiences do I bring into this to really help the leaders to be, successful. And to my earlier point, it really began with helping my leaders to understand that it's okay to not know, and it's okay to say I do not know, but I'm here alongside you. I'm here to learn with you, and I'm here to ultimately make sure that we do the very best things in the best interest of our children. Helping the school leaders really think about understanding emotional intelligence and being able to kind of read the room and really think about the staff that you're leading, because this was not just about children. This is about the adults who care for children too. And as a school leader, you have to have the capacity to think about both the health and welfare and social emotional well-being of both to navigate this pandemic. And principals in Philadelphia had some very real issues. Number one, where were the computers going to come from? Right? I had been as a Philadelphia school principal for 8 years and never had a classroom full of computers for each one of my students in schools, right? And so really thinking about where does the technology come from, A, B, how do we make sure that once we get that technology and we're able to give it to families, how do we support those families who don't have internet access? That was the other piece, right? These technical pieces. We have a lot of students in our district who are raised by grandparents and great aunts and so forth. And so they may get the technology, once we give them technology, how do they hook it up? I mean, we had issues with, families not even understanding how to connect the Wi-Fi that was provided to them, for their children to use. And then, the other real issue, Ms. Jones, who's been teaching for 20 or 30 years and just mastered email, now you're telling her to teach her class virtually, which is very different from in-person learning. And so how do we provide adequate resources to our teaching staff so they can provide the best quality instruction in a virtual platform? And how do you build community online? Which is very different from building community in the classroom, and really helping principals to navigate that piece and really support teachers in that way. And then some other nuances that that school leaders had to really think about was, they received so much mixed communication from higher ups about what to do, about protocols, about this, that, and the other, and the principal is still the rating officer. But how do you rate a teacher who's never navigated this pandemic in a virtual setting before? How do you say that they're an exemplary teacher or not, right? And how do you as a principal really kind of manage up so that doesn't become your focus and really just support teachers with being successful in this process? So there were a lot of nuances that had to be really thought about as I coach school leaders. And ultimately my messaging was, be human, be empathetic, understanding you don't know. So you can't expect them to know what you don't know, and walk through this process with them. And I think that my leaders who really were able to heed that advice had the most successful transition during the pandemic.
Wow. Jason, thank you for redirecting us and thinking about considering families in this conversation as well, because we heard that in the beginning, and also the introspection and the humility that it took for you as a leader to say there are some things that, because I've never led during a pandemic before, I can't say that I'm the expert here, but I'm willing to help you become the expert here. And something else that you brought up about thinking about the ways in which we prepare teachers to teach virtually, to cultivate community via Zoom. I want to transition into someone who did that during the pandemic. Erica. Erica, you have almost 2 decades of teaching experience with knowledge in individualized instruction in math and STEM learning concepts. And so when COVID affected the ways in which we teach students, just as Jason mentioned and others on the panel, you were one of the people who made this possible for your students, where you designed a curriculum for your students. You taught 5th graders on Zoom, and we would love to hear about how you approached this. How did you cultivate community? What worked for you? What did you consider to design the curriculum? These are some new territories, right? This is a new terrain that none of us have navigated. And what can we learn from your experiences?
Well, first I'd like to start off by saying I do have almost 2 decades of instruction. I started teaching when I was 10. So that it's kind of depressing when you hear it like that. I graduated, I heard one of my students, just a little side story. I was having a conversation with my students about the greatest Justin of all time, and my kids were saying it was Justin Bieber. And I said, no way, Justin Timberlake. And one of my kids was like, I don't even know who that is. And another one looked at him and said, he's from the 1900s. Needless to say, that kid did not pass 5th grade. But anyway, I digress. So in my experience, I'm very passionate about STEM. I'm very passionate about individualized learning. My experience, I've experienced teaching everyone from inclusive, severe intellectual disability students to kids with in various spots on the autism spectrum, to students who needed just a little extra facilitation and just minimal support. And so I approached teaching with all of those things in mind. And I happen to think that elementary school is the most important time, early childhood and elementary school, because kids are figuring out who they are. They have so much to take in. They have so many experiences to learn from. And it's where they start to figure out where they belong and what they're passionate about and what they care about, which is why I've made STEM kind of such a huge priority, because branching away from just the standard academics is, I feel like, very necessary, just like play therapy and all of these other recess, all of those experiences. So when COVID hit and I initially went into kind of panic mode of, well, thankfully I had my Google Classroom set up, so all my students had access to online resources, there was an online resource database that existed for them, and they knew how to access it. Not everybody could because of circumstances at home, Wi-Fi, not having computers. But there was a whole broad spectrum of teachers, similar to what Jason said, that had barely mastered email and didn't have a learning management system set up. And so they were just struggling to keep their head above water. And I had enough resources available, and my students, thankfully, had interacted with enough of these resources that we were able to maintain. And I became very cognizant of the other things that they needed, the social well-being, their emotional health, At that time, I had a lot of students whose parents were blue collar. They were in the field. They weren't in isolation. They didn't have the choice to be working from home. And so one of my students who was in 5th grade was at home all day with her 2nd grade brother, and it was just the two of them. And so while she is supposed to be learning, she's also having to manage and monitor and tend to her 2nd grade brother. And anybody who's tried to do online learning with a kid as an adult is difficult. So the idea of having the same expectation for her as I had for the other student who had mom and dad in the next room working and constantly coming in and checking with me to make sure he had everything that he needed. I realized that it wasn't even fathomable. And our leadership really, I felt like, dropped the ball in a lot of ways. And that was one of the ways, because their directives oftentimes were, well, make sure you're getting enough grades. Make sure that you're having some sort of assessment or some type of giving them grades for something. Make sure you only have 6 social studies grades. I was like, they're getting an education that is not, like, they're learning things that are not on a grade book. And so I have a tendency to be a bit rebellious. And so I just kind of said, screw it. I'm going to do what's best for my kids. And most of the time I just kind of gave them a participation grade, and I gave them opportunities to explore and do the things that they loved. And so some of them researched on the computer. Some of them went outside and were doing things outside. They just had to tell me what they wanted to do or what they were going to do or what they were going to share. And that was kind of how a lot of our days went. I also did as many engagement activities. I had them do scavenger hunts in their houses. I had just random little fun things to get them up and moving around, because, I mean, yes, preschool kids are impossible to wrangle even in person, but I mean, even as 10-year-olds, they don't need to be sitting at a screen. And it just was really, that part was really hard for me. And the fact that most of the things that I wanted to do with them, some of the kids had crayons and markers and pencils and stuff at home, but some of them didn't. And I'm not going to make the gap and the inequality even more highlighted by the fact that, these kids can do an art activity that I want to do, but these over here are just going to have to watch. And so that was my biggest challenge, was keeping the things that we were doing as beneficial to each individual student as possible, but then also trying to keep things as equitable as possible, or if anything, honoring and celebrating the students who didn't have, the advantages of, having both parents and perfect Wi-Fi. And so I kind of just paved my own way, and nobody knew any different.
Erica, I have to say, thank you for your work. And thank you because many of us still haven't figured it out. And it sounds like you have, albeit the Justin versus Justin thing. No. But I'm hearing a theme here. One, from the panelists that we're hearing from, it sounds like COVID didn't exacerbate inequality as much as it did expose it, right? It sounds like these things were already here. These things were present. We're seeing this highlighted more so because now it's impacted the ways in which our children are learning. We're hearing some disparities with, for some kids who grow socially and emotionally, right? Without that proximity to their peers. What does that look like? And then also with the purpose of education, right? What is the purpose of education? We know that we're going to teach our kids how to read, write, choose Timberlake over Bieber, and do all of these things, but truly, what is the purpose? And who gets what? And I want to transition here into talking with Erin. And as we're going on this continuum, Erin, rounding out what we can provide for parents in K-12 schools, we've heard from students, from parents, administrators, and educators on the panel so far, and you've been all of those things. And you are also a pioneer with curating resources for parents, particularly for marginalized parents, for students and families, for schools and researchers. And I'm hoping that we can hear a bit from you about what families can expect from Reading is Fundamental. How do you get a pulse on what resources we need, right? Because prior to this panel today, you've had to have some conversations with your colleagues, with students, with families about what's needed to navigate this very uncertain time. And how do you get these resources into the hands of the families?
Thank you. Yes, at Reading is Fundamental, we have a mission and philosophy of driving the joy of reading for children. How often do you hear that the mission is to drive joy? And we believe we found the secret sauce for that, but it's not so secret because I'm going to tell you what it is. Our equation is choice plus access plus engagement. Choice, meaning that children have the choice in selecting the books that they want to read and that they have the opportunity to see themselves represented by the characters in the books. Access, meaning that we are inclusive of all different types of medium, including digital and print books. And engagement. All of the resources that we design are, of course, standards Common Core aligned, but focus on driving student engagement. And we do that for families and for educators. But I'll highlight a particular program that I'm really excited is launching in the fall. It's a 3-year middle school family literacy initiative. It will be in 77 middle schools in 10 different cities around the country. And we have selected those 10 cities because those 10 cities have the largest achievement gap as measured by standardized reading scores between students of color and their white peers. So we're targeting those schools to build family engagement because we believe that families are the key to success for students. But we're not doing that in a way that Reading is Fundamental. We're a national nonprofit, but we believe in building local capacity. So we're not coming in and telling a prescriptive way to do family engagement. Rather, we're creating professional learning communities for families for educators to attend to learn about best practices in family engagement so that they can design family literacy opportunities that are culturally responsive to the communities that they serve. We do this because we believe that educators are the key to understanding the families and the communities that they serve. And by building capacity in them, we can increase this family engagement. So the other thing that we did, we talked about resources, is that we do curate book lists and book collections. We take into account when we do extensive research on the best literature out there for children that is representative of all the different affinities and identities, including race and ethnicity, religion, social economic status, gender identity and sexuality, and any other and differing abilities. And as well as the intersections of those, and we vet those with professionals in those fields to make sure that they're authentic. But so we've curated these book lists, but then of course we want there to be choice. So it is the educators who ultimately order the books that their children will get to take home and own for their very own, because again, we believe that the educators know the communities and the families that they serve best. So I've talked a lot now, but we have, as I said, we have 77 schools in this 3-year program that's launching in the fall. These solutions, all of them, are turnkey and they're also scalable. As a nonprofit, we're only ever limited by the financial resources that we have, which of course come in the form of donations.
Thank you, Erin. And considering we've heard so much now about what families endured at home, what educators and leaders endured in the school, and how we've navigated this as parents. I'm not a parent, but for those who are, how you all have navigated this as families. And before we shift gears into thinking about how this has impacted education in K-12, just to poll the audience really, really quick, a show of hands, who was in college when COVID hit?
Yeah,
Wow.
that's right.
Who would agree that they would describe their experience as chaos? Thank you all. As we begin to shift from thinking about what this looked like at home for families and their little ones, I'm going to turn to you, Amber. Thinking about how this looks in higher education, Amber, you previously, just very recently, oversaw programs where students were already in distance learning at Texas A&M. And moreover, some people may assume that COVID had little to no effect on the ways in which you all supported your students in those programs. What would you say to this, Amber? What can higher education institutions learn from you and your experience about how to support students either in person or from a distance?
So to begin, we're all in the business of education in this room. And I think that that's really important, though that we're the people sitting on the stage, right? We've all engaged in this space of education by the very nature of being Tillman Scholars, supporters, key leaders, the Tillman staff that keep us running. So in that case, we are all stakeholders in the realm of an educated citizenry. And when we talk about what is the goal of education, I think that's a path that we should all, and we probably all are, invested in various ways. And like Erin mentioned, change has to come from within. And guess what? We're within. So we should be a part of that change. And when I think about that in higher ed, yes, I was in charge of online education at Texas A&M. I was the least important person ever until the pandemic struck. And then all of a sudden, people cared. They were like, this online ed thing, this is a sham. We're just making a bunch of money. Those classes aren't very hard. Professors were clamoring at the bit to teach online, which all of us have now done. It's not easier, but there was this misnomer that that was true. And the pandemic, like you said so well, Darius, laid bare the systemic inequities that already existed for marginalized learners and families in our country. However, they've been very quickly swept up. And I think higher education in that space, working in that space during the pandemic, previously being a K-12 person myself, I realized that that research to practice divide that Sadia mentioned, that research to practice divide is terrible. And just like education is all of our business, so is fixing that. So I think that in higher ed, I realized we knew a lot about online education because we had been doing it in my programs for 12 years. We're a big school, just like many of you guys may be doing things online too, not just because of the pandemic, your programs might have been online. And because of that, we had a lot of institutional knowledge about how to do this, not right, but one way of doing it. Though, of course, would be very different with kids with the squishmallow things as they're bringing them to the front of their preschool classroom. But we had a lot of knowledge about learning management systems, about how to train people on those systems, about how to kind of speed up the uptake of knowledge for resistant learners, because faculty, let's say they're pretty resistant, right? But the divide between research where we were and practice where our K-12 teachers, and I'm in the College of Education, and that divide was still so large that getting that knowledge to the people who needed it was just tremendously difficult. And in many cases, it didn't happen. So we had teachers struggling to set up Schoology classrooms, to set up Google Classrooms, to set up Canvas if their school was that wealthy, to set up Blackboard, which some of us were using all of these things. And we really could have been a better resource. So I do think while we were able to pivot in my space in higher ed much easier, I think our folks that were doing labs, anybody that was in the science field had a much higher level of difficulty kind of making that pivot. But in education, we were very much more prepared in higher education because we had been doing so much online to reach practicing teachers already. But that research to practice divide, the lack thereof, was really disheartening for me as somebody working in that space.
And if I may, building on this point about the research to practice divide, now you'll be transitioning into a new role as a professor at Kansas State. What are you taking with you for your students, for your teaching, planning for your instruction? What have you learned from your previous role?
Thanks. I think three things. One, we all need to be more agile at the uptake of technology. And I know we probably have some like tech geniuses in here, so please help all of us. But we need to be more agile at learning new things because as teachers, they're called on to do that frequently. And I will be kind of overseeing pre-service teacher preparation, so baby teachers is what I call them, moving into the field to be middle school teachers, just like middle school English and high school English teachers. And so when I think about what do they need this technological agility, but not so much like they need to learn to teach with iPads. Well, no, because in 4 years when they graduate, guess what? We won't be using iPads anymore. I don't know. We'll be projecting from our watches, because I don't know about y'all, but when I started teaching, I was still using the projector or the overhead. And then we made the projector, and I thought it was like, ooh, and now it's like, oh, that's old news. But I mean, and my projector was like my prized possession from Donors Choose. Like I held it with my heart.
Technology.
Yes, so this technological agility is important. The second thing is, and you guys talk so wonderfully about this, all of our parents, this connection, not parents as partners like on a poster, but like a true connection between families and pre-service teachers from the beginning of their training, I think is important. There's a lot of considerations to think about there, but when we were 20 years old, and some of us may be closer to that, it was a long time ago for me. I won't talk about Erica.
1900s.
Yes, in the 1900s. But you aren't really thinking about families of people, right? Because you're so focused on yourself. And so I think helping our pre-service teachers see how important that connection is. I call it a co-conspirator relationship with families. That's what we should be doing. We should be creating kind of this triangle of trust to surround a child's success so that we can reach every single learner in our classes. And that has to be undergirded by kind of a third piece, which is rebranding this achievement gap of struggling students to be an opportunity gap that is created by our system and our society that needs to be ameliorated with kind of equity debts that are owed to these students and their families. And we do that by rebranding our families and our students as striving readers and learners instead of struggling readers and learners. And so I think creating those three identities in new upcoming teachers would be really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. Striving readers. That was a term that I used in my dissertation too.
It's from Franklin Brooks in Boston. It's not mine. So.
And thinking about us all being co-conspirators in supporting the needs of others, right? Em, I want to turn to you because medicine, healthcare, and occupational therapy are often missing from these conversations when we talk about education, particularly with supporting students who may not have access to technology. They may have some discrepancies with how to operate it and otherwise. And so you teach and you prepare folks who will go into the field of occupational therapy and to go out into the world to provide this care. And we've heard many issues brought up during this panel. And I know that you've been thinking about this associated with occupational therapy in education and beyond. And how should we consider occupational therapy in education? What are some of the long-term effects of COVID with OT that you've been thinking about? And how would you respond to that?
So I think as a gerontologist, one of my big concerns is for the older adult population and the long-term health effects of all of us, long COVID, different lung conditions. And so, one of the things that I really emphasize with my students typically was about chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. And so I've now shifted that. They still learn about that to long haul COVID and having an understanding of how to treat that condition because it affects so many systems and the breadth of symptoms are really wide. And so I really want to make sure that they understand how to teach energy conservation techniques so people can participate in those daily activities that are important and meaningful to them and necessary for them to do. And to also understand that there's some research that's showing there's some potential linkage to something called POTS, which is a postural sort of condition that your heart rate increases. And so we're seeing some of these similarities between these conditions. And is this unique to COVID? Is this something where, people are developing these other conditions? So students really need to be skilled in that. Students also need to be skilled in something called occupational deprivation. we all experienced occupational deprivation. What that means is, I probably should have backed up and explained what OT actually is. But the word occupation means all the things that you want to, need to do that occupy your life. So from bathing and showering and taking care of yourself, to going to school, to going to work, to getting out into the community, all of those sorts of things. And so we've experienced this occupational deprivation. And what we know in occupational therapy is that participation in these meaningful occupations actually is a determinant of health. And so when you're not participating in those things, your quality of life declines, and you might also get sick. So, I think students need to understand that they also are experiencing that themselves. I experienced that myself. A lot of us up here talked about experiencing those things ourselves. So understanding how we can, provide this opportunity to access occupations, to access the ability to participate, the ability to engage. And I think you probably maybe want to know a little about theory.
I do. I had a follow-up about beyond the ways in which you're thinking about this in your teaching, in your research, because you're also a professor and you think about these issues and the nuances around them. What are some of these, what are the theoretical implications of this, the clinical implications of this, and how are you thinking about this in your research scope going forward?
Yeah, I was hoping that you would want to know, all PhDs want to know about theory, right? So the theory for me that comes to mind is something that's called occupational justice. It's not the same as social justice, but there's a lot of similarities with that. And occupational justice is providing that equity, and notice I'm using the word equity and not equality, providing equity and fairness in opportunities to participate in occupations. And so, that means, and you touched on this a little bit too, that means that, students need different things, right? People, all of us need different things to be able to be successful, to be able to participate. And so we need to be able to think about occupational justice as we are educators to ensure that our students have the kinds of things that they need and so that they are able to successfully participate. I mean, we also are at an intersection of a civil rights movement, right? And so, you had said things weren't exacerbated. I think they are. They are exacerbated, and I think that they are certainly highlighted. There's a huge spotlight on all of that disparity. And so occupational justice is something that can enable us to feel okay about giving people different things so that they can be successful, so that they can participate in their education, so they can participate in their communities, that sort of thing. Can I just say one other thing too? You mentioned the research to practice gap. So translational health science, that's literally what we do. There is a 17-year gap between research and practice. And that is across all fields, not just healthcare, not just education, you name it. You have a 17-year gap before you're actually applying that research. So we know how fast things are coming out. How old are the things that you are trying to implement? And so as a translational health scientist, one of the things that I'm trying to do is to speed up those processes. And so by speeding up those processes, I particularly was looking at older adults in the community and helping them to remain in their homes and communities. We didn't talk a lot about that today, but older adults were and are the most vulnerable population to COVID. And so when I was doing my research, I had to be really careful about, interacting with them, because at the time, it was more important for them to get a vaccine than it was for them to participate in my research. But it was also important for them to be connected socially. So trying to transect occupational therapy and translational health science, and then also being a mother, all of these things were really difficult. But I think what's important is a clinical and practical and theoretically driven takeaway is that, you have to give people what they need to be successful.
For those in the audience and those who are listening, as we begin and continue to think about with social justice, occupational justice as well, what that means for all of us, our kids, for us in this room, for us, for those who are watching, and for those who don't have access, right? I want us to take a brief moment and get back into this time machine, okay? Probably listening to Justin Timberlake. I don't know.
He's controversial.
I'm listening to Beyonce. I don't know, you know. And as we're in this time machine, we went from the past and where we were in 2020. We're talking about the things that we're doing today, and I want us to go into the future. And the last closing question for the panel, and prior to getting to the audience question, so if you have one, we're about to move into that part in just a moment. But as we land in the future, and as we continue to navigate this pandemic as a country, globally, education, mental health, life, all may be significantly impacted by COVID more. Could be exacerbated. And it could expose things that are already there that we aren't necessarily paying attention to. Panelists, with this in mind, 2 questions, and you can feel free to answer one or more or none of these. The first is, what could leaders, teachers, administrators, families, and or their students learn about how to navigate education in the midst of COVID from your experience, from now going into the future? And the second part is, what do you predict will be a rising issue in education? And how might we be proactive about addressing this as leaders in this room, as students, as parents, as families, as people?
I'll take the latter part of the question and go up. So what we've learned is that if we determine that we want to change something, we can, right? I spoke earlier about us trying to find out in Philadelphia, how do we get technology to students? Well, when schools shut down, all of a sudden, donors came, philanthropists, everyone was willing to contribute. Monies came out of everywhere so that we could get technology in the hands of our students. And other resources as well, because we had to think about, well, how do we feed children too, right? So we were able to open up resources in communities, recreation centers, to make sure that our children receive breakfast and lunch every day, because, for a lot of our children, school is where they got fed, right? And so we had to think about those types of things as well. How are we thinking about social emotional support for our children and staff? And we were able to, find resources and things of that nature to support that. So what we've learned is that we can adjust, and people are willing to contribute. And we just have to really prioritize education as the most important thing. I also think looking forward toward the future, we really need to think about, as a country, recognizing and empowering our teachers as professionals, and retaining our teachers. And how do we do that? By giving them, fair compensation, an ability to, grow in their work by paying for school, et cetera, keeping them in the field, because it's hard to find teachers today. We're finding that a lot of people are leaving the profession simply because they don't feel valued. Right? We're asking them to perform miracles, but we don't, as a country, really value truly the work that they do. And so I think that as we look about, because this won't be the only pandemic, right? I think as we look forward to what we need to really make sure that we're guaranteeing the success of our students, we have to really make sure that we are investing truly in education and treating our teachers, our support staff, our school leaders, et cetera, as the professionals that they are, and truly value them.
First Amber and then Erica, sorry.
Jason basically said all of the words I was going to say, but better. So the only thing I would add, I think we are at this kind of precipice of importance in education, because we did very quickly shift, right? We shifted to online, then we shifted to this hilarious double hybrid thing. And anybody who taught or learned in that format, it's the worst. And then we've now kind of shifted back in many places to business as usual with a large asterisk, right? So because I don't want to sideline the struggles that people are continuing to go through in their families. But as we look to this future in our time machine, I think that all of the points that Jason attended to are so important. In addition to kind of pay and those things, we have to think about what undergirds the deprofessionalization of education. And it's largely because It's an entry-level field for people that are frequently from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which we know in this country means racial divides. And then the other thing is that it's a profession largely monopolized by women. And so I think both of those things are important to attend to, because we are, just like the medical field, which is so incredibly understaffed at the moment as well. We really appreciated these frontline workers, but they're all leaving. And unfortunately, many of us on this panel are the people, I mean, we at some point were teaching, right? So we're bad examples of that very truth, because we are no longer in the field, and hopefully we're making an impact in a different way, but that's always present on my mind. And I'm sure those of us who have left the classroom feel that way. And so I think we have to find ways to keep great teachers in schools. We are kind of finding new ways of recruiting teachers. Alternative certification programs, which is a whole nother conversation for a different time, are doing things like diversifying our teaching force, but we need to make sure that early career teachers have induction and kind of continuous supports for success. And then we have to pay them well. And then we need to do things like not having teachers have the largest amount of student loan debt aside from medical professionals. That's absurd. Those things need to change for the future so that we aren't at this great resignation, which I do think is where we are currently.
So thank you, Amber. So Amber and Jason kind of looked at it from more kind of an administrative down. I, with my decades in the classroom, see things from I was the boots on the ground. I finished my last year of teaching in May, and this is just going to keep getting worse until after school starts, I'm sure, because that is the only thing I've ever wanted to do for as long as I can remember, is to teach, and I love it. And it has nothing to do with the students that I left. I know sometimes people say the kids, are disrespectful and the behavior, and those are all symptoms of something else. And I love being able to be that positive impact and influence in those kiddos' lives. And I'm not leaving the classroom because of the pay or because it was too stressful or too time consuming, which all of those are true. I'm leaving the classroom because I got fed up with the politics and the paperwork and the policies that interfered with me being able to do my job. I constantly said that to anybody in administration, in my principal and my superintendent, anybody that would listen, I would say, let me do my job. I know these kids. I spend hours with them. This is what excuse me. This is what I have wanted to do and what I am passionate about. Let me do it. And instead, I was having to document in 3 different places that I was providing accelerated instruction for students who didn't take a standardized test. Not because they needed the intervention, but because they didn't take the test and the state was mandating that we provide this 90 minutes a week of intervention. And I had to document it for the state and the district and my campus, which was as much, if not more time than I actually spent doing the interventions, not to mention the kids that actually needed the intervention, because there was some learning gaps and there was some inequalities, and it just became too much to be able to teach the way that I knew that I needed to and the way that I know what's best for kids, because it competed with what leadership was saying. So kind of going back to research and best practices versus actually like practice and what we do in the classroom. Those of you that may not feel like you're a part of education, you have a say. Those of you that are in public policy, governmental policy, those of you that vote, those are the people that are making the decisions that trickle down to what teachers are doing in the classroom. TEA in Texas is run by a bunch of people who have never been in the classroom, which is absurd to me. And you think like, that's funny, that's stupid. No, it is stupid, but it is 100% true. because it's all political. And so in my research, what I've figured out, like, why aren't we doing the things that students need? It goes back to policy and the state mandates and state legislation that is pushed down on districts, that's then pushed down on administrators, that's then pushed down on teachers, so that just envelops our entire world. And that's not anything that a principal has anything, can do anything about, or teachers can do anything about, or college professors, because the certification process and the training that teachers need all are mandated by federal and state policy. So there's only so much that the people on this panel can do except for advocate for students and advocate for teachers. It really, it takes a lot of very loud, powerful voices. So that's my sales pitch to go out and vote.
I just want to mention too, you talked about the Great Resignation, and I have serious concerns. We know across the country that admission rates are down in healthcare fields in particular, so in occupational therapy and in nursing too, that I'm familiar with. They're down. Who's going to be there to take care of everybody who has been impacted by COVID now? Not to mention all the other conditions, that people put on hold so that they didn't have to go into the hospital system, or they weren't allowed into the hospital system yet. So I have serious concerns about, increasing those admission rates for professions like occupational therapy and professions like nursing. And, how are we going to address that? I think the other thing I wanted to mention is, this technology, this hybrid learning isn't going anywhere. We've all experienced it now, and people feel more comfortable behind their screens. And I have noticed that in my therapy students, that, when I ask them to go out into the community to experience, one of the things we do is experience what it feels like as the best we can to have a disability and to go into the community. And the level of anxiety that those students had was really troubling to me. Once we talked about some strategies and some things that they could do while they were out in the community, they were okay. But we're also sort of getting used to fully online, and so we need to find ways to ensure that we're doing some sort of hybrid, particularly for those professions that you're in a clinical world, you're going out. You can't work remotely. People can't get nursing care over the computer. Well, maybe for some things, some telehealth, but it's really critical that we try to find really innovative ways to use technology so that we can continue to have these critical professions.
I want us to pause here for just a moment because this is a lot to take in, a lot. We've heard from all of the panelists, and before we transition into hearing from you all, your questions and things that you're thinking about and you're wondering about, as we consider how to future-proof education going forward, listening to everything, all of the brilliance, the experience, the wisdom, the love, everything here that we just heard from the panelists, have 6 themes here. The first is to consider the intersection of multiple identities: disability in education, indigeneity in education, race in education, income in education, the intersections of how you can be impacted by multiple things at one time. The second is social emotional well-being and mental health for all of us in this room, our children, our students, the folks who are watching, all of us in the world. The third is empowering educators. You have a vote, you have a say, use it. Empower folks around you, the folks who teach you, your kids, empower yourself. The fourth is addressing the research to practice divide. For all of you who are in leadership roles and for those of you who advise others, consider what that means for the future. Because as you can see, times are changing just like that. And it's not going to slow down. The fifth is justice, whether it be occupational or social or otherwise. And equity, and giving up something so that someone else can have it. And the last is prioritizing joy, remembering to give yourself some grace, some time, some love, and how to cultivate that right here. Can we give a hand to our panelists, please? From the bottom of my heart, I want to thank all 6 of you for traveling here, for prepping for this, and for pouring yourselves into everything that you shared with us today. We know that it wasn't enough time, but it was a time, and you helped to make that time special. So thank you. We want to thank the Pat Tillman Foundation for providing this platform for us to raise these issues together from different walks of life, from K-12 all the way to the folks who we serve in retirement homes. All of these things here, we were able to do together. It was not easy. We had to shift some things around because there were just people who couldn't be here. But and we also want to thank the audience. And with that being said, we're ready to hear from you all. Oh my goodness. Let's go. And before, I just want to say, just really quick for housekeeping, if you could just say your name, your affiliation with the Tillman Foundation, and if you have a question for a specific panelist, please address that person by name.
Hi, Natasha Ryan, 2018 scholar. My mother is a para, so I got an opportunity to see a lot of what you guys experienced up close and personal. And we're in Georgia, which is a very polarized, very divided state for political reasons. So we ran into a lot of issues where at one point they had released individuals that were nonviolent criminals from the prisons. And so a lot of those individuals returned home during this time in the pandemic. And because we're so divided, there were a lot of parents that wanted their kids taught in person, and there were a lot of parents that wanted their kids taught virtually. So my mom had to do both. So she had to do basically like virtual in the morning and then go in person in the evening. So there were students though that my mom was really wrecked over because they would be there one day and then they wouldn't be online for a week. And she didn't know what their home situation was. Did somebody that did get released return to their home? Is that kid in danger? Is that kid eating? Because some of the kids coming to school, that is where they got their food. So I wanted to know, I know how my mom handled it. I wanted to know how you guys handled that stress of only being able to have so much control over those situations.
So I can only give the example from my school and the turnkey solutions that we came up with in terms of supply pickup, because some of you have mentioned they don't all have the supplies. Teachers went in and put together supply kits so that every single child would have the same supplies that they could access. We had an opportunity for families to come and pick up those supplies. 95% of families picked them up, which was great. And then we sent out teachers to deliver those supplies to the households that didn't pick them up. Same thing for meals. We had a day every week that families could come and pick up meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the entire week. If teachers ever noticed that a child was having trouble with connectivity, they would let someone on our staff know, and that person would bring a wireless hotspot to that child's home. So these were all things that we did to address those situations. Same things with if kids weren't on the Zoom, if they weren't showing up, we would send somebody to their home to check in on them. we found that some children were having trouble accessing just getting on the Zoom. So we opened up learning pods at the school. These were learning pods for children who had either childcare, their family was experiencing childcare issues, couldn't be with them at home. So we created these learning pods for them at school so they could still do the virtual learning, but with a YMCA supervisor at the school. So those are just some examples of how we addressed it. When I did a survey of books for ownership coordinators for Reading is Fundamental, I found that they, especially in rural areas, did similar things. When we would donate books to them, they would have opportunities at a McDonald's parking lot or whatever it was for students to come and pick up their books, pick up their meals, and use the Wi-Fi in the McDonald's parking lot. And they had diaper drives and other things too. So they kind of tried to make it a one-stop shop for families to get the resources that they needed.
So my district didn't take that kind of initiative at all. So at the start of 2021, actually the summer before, knowing that we were at least starting the year virtual, I set up a donors choose campaign and got donations so that I could get all of my students whiteboards, markers, construction paper, earpods, or not AirPods, just earbuds. And because I was very concerned about their social and just emotional well-being, I hand delivered all of those to every student that I had because I wanted to see what their home life is like. I wanted to meet the parents. I wanted to know everything that I didn't see on that screen. I wanted to know what the environment was around them because you can't expect somebody who isn't eating to be concerned with learning how to multiply fractions. And so that I made that a priority. And so I knew, if Patrick didn't show up on Zoom, he's lazy and just overslept, as opposed to, if Tanisha didn't show up, that was something to be a little more concerned about because I know her parents, were struggling. And so I felt like that was an important step for me to know and interact with the parents and the student face to face before we met virtually or before we worked virtually together.
I just want to quickly say it is 11 and Erin has a flight to catch that our time machine can't get her to. So Erin, please feel free whenever you need to take care and take off. I have some cards for Reading is Fundamental to give out if you want to get in contact with Erin. But I just wanted to say that, whenever you need to, we do have time for 3 more questions.
Hello.
Yes. Okay.
My name is Natasha also, and I'm a 2022 scholar. I have a follow-up question for both of you that just answered, or anybody really. But I am wondering if when you brought the supplies to people's homes or did the check-ins, did you have resistance from parents that felt like, okay, this is our business, leave us alone. Like, you do your teaching virtually, but don't come into my house. Don't follow up like that. Because I'm a social worker. I worked in foster care. And I am usually the person that comes in and I'm met with resistance, like, just leave us alone. Did you face any of that in that aspect?
For me, culturally, I work and live in a predominantly Hispanic area, and culturally, they are usually very accepting and open and respectful to teachers. And I encountered a lot of just appreciation and just thankfulness that I was making the effort. I always try to make contact at the beginning of the school year anyway, just to start on a positive note. So they appreciated that I was coming beforehand and taking the initiative. There's a couple, I guess, that were not as welcoming, but it had more to do with like health issues, or at least that's what they said. They were not wanting to get anything that I had touched or anybody else had touched. But as far as like social hesitation, no.
Yes, and I didn't experience any either. And I wonder if part of that was on the front end, that part of the something that was very important to the school that I was at was building relationships with families. And so we had built those before the pandemic happened, that this didn't seem like something that was unexpected or unwelcome to them. I will add, one thing that we found was important was bringing a translator with us if there were families that spoke languages other than English in the home, and also having all the communications that we were sending home to families, because there were many during the pandemic about schoolwork and when to be logged into Zoom and all these things. Having those in the native language of the families we worked with was crucial.
I'm Heather King. I'm a 2013 Tillman Scholar. And Erin, before you leave, I just want to say you're amazing.
Thank you.
Your heart is, I mean, it's just on display. And I just, as a parent, I appreciate that. Second, like Natasha said, she lives in Georgia. I also live in a southern state. And right now our state is kind of in an educational crisis. Our governor essentially said that he didn't think that teachers in Tennessee were educated or smart enough to be educated. And because of that, you guys talked about the Great Resignation. We've had almost 4,000 teachers resign because they were doing this. They could in COVID. We had parents in my child's school district who were just not supportive of teachers, and teachers were doing the best they could. Parents expected the same exact milestones and markers and tests and all of these things, and it just, you know, it just made things really, really hard. And so now kind of an after effect is we don't have anybody that wants to teach, and the South is a really hard place to be in and raise a child right now in an education system. And so my question to you, to all of you really is, one of the things that it's happening is I feel like, at least in our counties, in our education system right now, is that there's, by our leaders, there's kind of this, almost like the pandemic didn't happen.
Yes.
And it's just like, okay, well, on to the next thing. And now we have all these children that are going up through school, and they're going to be our leaders, and we expect them to be change makers, and they're not being supportive. And Erica, I appreciate your point about your social child. My child has struggled. She is a social person, and she grows more from that. And so the pandemic has wrecked her life, and she's in therapy, and she is a mess. And parents in my community are struggling because how do we support parents? I mean, how do we support teachers without the politics? Like, all of our kids in Middle Tennessee, they're struggling and they're lost, and nobody knows what the long-term effects are, because right now they're just being written off and expected to perform business as usual. And as a parent, I don't know how to support you as educators. I don't know how to support my child other than just being that emotional rock for her. And you talk about access, and these are all things that we don't know how to go forward. I need all of you to get on the plane and go to Tennessee and please talk to our governor and talk to these people, because it's become so politicized, and it shouldn't be. And how do you tell teachers what you do matters when the governor says you're idiots? Like, those were his words.
we can add Tennessee to the list with Georgia and Florida, which is a separate conversation, and Texas, where Eric and I are. We've thought about this. I'm sure Erica thinks about it all the time. So the kinds of amazing things Erin is doing with Darius as well, that kind of work, Texas teachers don't have access to it because they're currently not allowed to choose the books that are read in their classroom because the legislature, again, with no education experience, somehow knows best. So they're silencing the choice of teachers and students in our classrooms. That's a problem. It's a civil rights problem. It's a problem. And so I think, and two, in Florida, you can't say certain words. In Georgia, certain people can't vote. In Texas, you also, anything we do, and I think saying education isn't political, education is political because only in the sense that we're engaging in citizen building, right? So that is a political act, but treating people kindly and raising empathetic, well-rounded people who we treat what they need, we give them what they need, not everybody the same. Those things aren't political. And so I think to that point, yes, 100%. But what do? We move with our feet and our hands and our voices. And as a group, I think in your various spaces, if your parents engage, if you're voting, engage. I mean, that's what we're all kind of saying, like teachers really are, we're at the bottom of the totem pole. So we could really use help. We could use folks who have an amplified space. And that looks like reposting people on social media. And to your friends that I know in Texas, I got a contentious group of friends, right? And in the military community, it's a contentious community. So finding ways to amplify things that do bring forward these issues, and then talking about it at dinner with people wherever, at Cracker Barrel, if you're in Texas, that's where you go. I mean, all of these different places, like those things are important. And I think not writing off the South because the barbecue is really great, but also because there is enough of us to create discord, just like the app. And so we really should be trying to do that as a community. And I think finding ways to partner with teachers and saying like, yo, how can I help you? Like, how can I relate to you? But because I'm an optimist, but I want to say like, we can do this, guys. We really can.
I'm optimistic too. I do find the rhetoric though about getting back to normal very problematic.
Agreed.
Why are we so eager to get back to a system that was failing so many before? So I think that's what I found through my research is what can we take that we learned from the pandemic? I had kids who were ending their traditional Zoom learning at 1 p.m. and getting the opportunity to go outside. I had an 8th grader who Zoom interviewed Gloria Steinem for her project. I had a group of 3rd graders who had the former executive assistant of Ruth Bader Ginsburg come and do a class lecture on the 3 secrets of RBG. And I had many, many students who got to practice civic engagement through participating with their families in the Black Lives Matter marches. All of those things are not traditional forms of learning, but we can continue those even though the pandemic is somewhat over and we're trying to get back to normal.
I think also voting, right, which you mentioned. And one of the things that that I'm doing with the students is debates, practicing debates so that they can actually have the civil discourse so that they can feel empowered to go out there and advocate and know what they're talking about in a way that makes them feel confident. So I think we need to continue to demonstrate civil discourse amongst ourselves as well, because we need to be able to have those really difficult conversations, and we need to be able to empower people to understand that who you vote for matters, that the services that people receive are going to be significantly impacted by certain individuals. So,
yeah, I would also just quickly add that Heather, we have this platform here, and I would love to collaborate with you on whether it's a Make Your Mark or it's something that we can do with our affiliation with the Pat Tillman Foundation. So we can touch base afterwards. Thank you for your question. We have time for one more.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I've learned so much from all of you, and I'm just so grateful to be in conversation. I'm also taking a moment to recognize my privilege and grateful for the community that I come from. One thing I haven't heard from yet, and I wanted everybody to know about, and you probably already do, is the PTA. So the PTA at my school at Holmes Elementary is really, really, really strong because we break down jobs. So there's 30 different hats, and each of those people does one job. So no parent feels like they're so overwhelmed. There's so much things that they have to do. We spread the wealth. And not only that, we fundraise galore by simple things, stickers, pencil cells. And with that money, I am floored by how much money we raise at my school. We have a $130,000 budget, the PTA. Okay, the PTA. And I don't live in the high, richy, ado places in San Diego. I live in struggling middle class San Diego. People that, are blue collar as well as striving young professional families. $130,000 a year. With that money, we pay an extra PE teacher. We have an extra music teacher. We have after school programs that come to the campus, so that parents are not shuffling their children everywhere being chauffeurs. And then my personal job is to be the website manager for the PTA for parent-teacher communication, but also for parent-to-parent communication. And I support our teachers in our online website whenever they have announcements. So I even step up to do the administrator's, back-end website job because I was trained to do that in the Air Force. So we really try to leverage the professionalism that our parents bring, but also just their ideas, their energy, and their hands. So if we spread the wealth in the PTA and everyone can just do one job, just one, you're not going to be overwhelmed. You can join our community, and that's all you have to do. Just bring the copies to the teacher. That's all. And so I just want to put a plug in for the PTA.
Well, and also the student organizations, empowering the student organizations to do things as well, right? So, I know I want to shout out to our Student Occupational Therapy Association, who created like sensory packages and delivered those to students, because it's not just children with sensory needs that needed those kinds of things, but those students were so empowered to do something too in a volunteer sort of fashion. And I know it's not PTA, but in a similar sentiment, they felt like they should step up and do something. I mean, who didn't need like a little squeezy ball while they were sitting on Zoom,
I was just going to add that one of the themes that I'm hearing from you, Darius, and from everybody else is that advocacy can be at any level. So whether you are a parent of a preschooler or you are, teaching at K-12 or, a professor, like, for example, I'm leaving this feeling so inspired. My school board needs a parent representative for the Students with Disabilities Committee. And I'm like, at first I was teetering. I was like, do I have time? But now I'm like, no, like, absolutely. Like, I can do that. And that's something at my level, I can affect change. And I really am learning that from you guys. So thank you. As somebody who's putting my boots on as you're taking yours off, just seeing the level of compassion that you have and the genuine love that you have for your students, as dire as it all seems. We're talking about teacher burnout and teachers leaving in throats, but like, people like you give parents like me hope, and also incoming educators hope as well. So thank you all for inspiring me. And don't forget, we are all advocates. Whether you're a parent or not, you might be a parent in the future or, a caregiver, but we can affect change at every level. And I think people like us, we come together and we can make it happen. Thanks.
I'm so full, and I know that you all are too. I know that we didn't get a chance to get to all of the questions. We will be around for the weekend. Please find any of us. And I also have cards to contact Aaron directly, who has to leave us today, unfortunately. But I just wanted to quickly say that what we're hearing here is that as we begin to go forward in how we future-proof education, every single person in this room has a role. Please do your part. Bring your resources, your brilliance, your love, your joy, and your ideas into this together as we go forward. Can we give a hand for everybody in this room?